The Interests of Civilization, Marx's Visions of Race and Culture. On August 7, 1866, Karl Marx wrote the first of a series of letters to Friedrich Engels and Ludwig Kugelmann, enthusiastically recommending a new book, The Origin and Transformation of Man and Other Beings, by the French traveler and amateur scientist Pierre Temas. Marx's enthusiasm was not shared by Engels, that the book is absurd, nor by the scientific community nor by the general public. Like Hume's treatise on human nature, it seems to have fallen dead of the press. Unlike the treatise, it enjoyed no revival. Completely ignored in the histories of biology, geology, and paleontology, its importance derives solely from the fact that Marx thought of it as a breakthrough over Darwin scientifically and much more significant in its historical and political applications. Temas's correspondence is well known, at least among scholars concerned with the attitudes of Marx and Engels toward Darwin. As someone interested in that general topic, I was eventually led to read the original letters, having until then relied on summaries and short versions in the literature. I was immediately struck by a phrase that my studies had not prepared me to find. As Temas indicates, he was in Africa for a long time. The common black type is just a degeneration of a very tall one. The omission of this phrase in large part, though it turned out that not all Marx-Darwin literature, naturally led to the following question: what other commentaries on race may have been more or less systematically edited from literature? Marx's view of the Jews has been debated for many years, and his unflattering and Engels' references to the Slavs are also well known. But what about their attitudes towards other groups, such as blacks and Irish, and the links between their views of various cultures? These questions in turn raise another, logically earlier, given the very real differences between the concepts of race of the 19th and 20th centuries, the links between race and biology, and the content of biology itself. How can we characterize the views of Marx and Engels in a way that is faithful to the texts, but to avoid looking through a dark glass of the 20th century at the men who were, as we shall see, very much of the 19th century? In the 20th century, to argue that differences between human groups have a biological basis is necessarily to imply that those differences are largely beyond human control. If human populations are importantly genetically distinct, there is much we can do about it, given the impermeability of genes to direct environmental manipulation. Modern genetics, in turn, has led to a clear distinction between biological and cultural explanations of human differences, the former assuming relative mobility, the latter relative plasticity. In this context, the epithet racist has been applied almost exclusively to those views that attribute non-trivial differences between human populations to biological differences, therefore more or less permanent. The 19th century did not recognize a sharp break between biological and cultural explanations, nor could it, given the lack of a genetic theory that would make such a distinction plausible. 19th century genetics was predominantly Lamarckian, that is, based on the assumption that organisms actively adapt to their environments by acquiring characteristics, both physical and behavioral, that over a period of time are inherited. The view that acquired characters are under certain heritable conditions, although it had its 19th century critics, most notably August in Germany and Alfred Russel Wallace, Edward Poulton, and E. Ray Lankester in England, was widely accepted even after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. Although today we recognize the incompatibility of Darwinism and Lamarckism, the 19th century did not. Darwin himself set out to explain the origin of variation, at least in part, through Lamarckian factors, having rejected the alternatives of salting, macromutation, and hybridization. Moreover, as a result of serious criticism directed at his explanation of the mechanism of evolution, i.e., natural selection, Darwin's followers, such as the German Ernst Haeckel, allowed an even greater scope of Lamarckian factors in evolution than Darwin. Darwin's critics, of course, went even further, some to the point of abandoning selection altogether in favor of explanations based on the direct adaptation of organisms to their environment. This point is crucial to an understanding of 19th century racial attitudes, as Lamarckian assumptions may imply very different conclusions about the nature of racial differences than modern genetic theory. Considering the assumption that the data acquired are hereditary, it follows that poor environments, whether natural or cultural, are almost inexorably bound to reflect biologically. Backward peoples, whatever the original reason for their failure to develop, must, after centuries of living in disadvantaged environments, be biologically degenerate. This was, in fact, the argument followed at the beginning of the assault on Mendelian genetics in the Soviet Union by biologists such as I.U. A. Filipchenko. Filipchenko argued that opponents of Mendelism assumed that only good environments are heritable. A consistent Lamarckian interpretation, he noted, implied that all disadvantaged populations, including the proletariat, would be genetically lamed. The potentially reactionary character of Lamarckism was also affirmed by J.B.S. Haldane, a distinguished Marxist geneticist, who stated in the British Daily Worker, "Lamarckism is now being used to support the reaction." A British biologist who holds this view thinks it is not good to offer self-government to peoples whose ancestors have long been oppressed, or education to the descendants of many generations of illiterates. However, it has to explain why even the children of speakers should still be taught to speak, even though men have been speaking for hundreds of generations. The pessimistic and negative side of Lamarckism, with its implication that poor environments are genetically paralyzing, is illustrated by Engels' discussion of the difficulty of teaching mathematics to Bushmen and black Australians. In The Dialectic of Nature he writes, "Modern natural science has ended the principle of the origin of all the thought content of experience in a way that breaks its ancient limitation and metaphysical formulation. Recognizing the inheritance of acquired characteristics, it extends the theme of the individual's experience to gender. The unique individual who must have experienced is no longer necessary, his individual experience can be replaced to some extent by the results of the experiences of several of his ancestors. If, for example, among us the mathematical axioms seem self-evident to every 8-year-old child, and they do not need proof of experience, this is only the result of accumulated inheritance. It would be difficult to teach them by a test to a Bushman or black Australian." On the other hand, some highlighted the reversibility of biological degeneration. From this point of view, genetic differences are considered to be real but transient. Given Lamarckian assumptions, it is possible to emphasize modifiability or cumulative effects of the environment. In the German ideology, Marx emphasizes the more positive side of Lamarckism. Max Stimmer: "He has no idea that the developmental capacity of children depends on the development of their parents, and that all this crippling under existing social relations has arisen historically, and in the same way can be abolished again in the course of historical development. Even naturally evolved differences within the species, such as racial differences, etc., which Sancho Stimmer does not mention at all, can and should be abolished in the course of historical development." In this passage, Marx expresses the optimistic aspect of Lamarckism in an extreme form: all racial differences can, over time, be overcome. However, this conclusion is not necessarily implied by Lamarckian genetics. Whether crippled breeds can be restored depends, most importantly, on the reasons for their degeneration. Not much can be done about the weather, for example. When Marx refers to the real races, unlike his general and theoretical pronouncements on race, we will see that he is much less optimistic about the possibility of improvement. In addition, for all Lamarckians, whether the timescale of improvement is short or prolonged depends on the extent of degeneration, as well as its causes. Marx never suggests how quickly the improvement he envisions could occur. He most likely did not have a clear idea. Lamarckian assumptions also blur the modern distinction between nations and races. References to French, Italian, Greek, Jewish, Russian, or Slavic races in 19th century literature simply describe peoples with a common language, religion, and history, not peoples who are biologically distinct. But given the widespread assumptions of the 19th century, A human population that maintained a unity of language and culture would make me a race. Nations are, in the words of George Stocking, races in the process of formation. The author of Heredity and Progress, an article that appeared in the English socialist magazine Progress in 1885, expressed the conventional wisdom of his time when he wrote, "Anyone who regards the Jews will immediately see that their character, as much as their noses, are an inheritance. A trapped young Scotsman, as Johnson put it, may lose some of the superficial characteristics, but he will retain all the national peculiarities of his race, and so will the Irishman." This is not to claim that the term race was never used in a purely cultural sense, but given the nature of 19th-century genetics, references to various national cultural groups as races should generally be understood as implying some degree of biological distinction. That national characteristics are for some extended biologically based is assumed even by explicitly anti-racialist writers. For example, George Plekhanov, criticizing Antonio Labriola's views on the effect of race on historical development, however, admits less. The temperament of each nation retains certain peculiarities, induced by the influence of the natural environment, which to some extent are modified, but never completely destroyed, by adaptation to the social environment. These peculiarities of the national temperament constitute what is known as race. The exact relationship between biology and culture was undoubtedly unclear to most 19th-century writers. It had to be, given a genetic doctrine according to which acquired characters were hereditary, but which suggested no mechanism by which this process could be occur. Therefore, the question of how easily racial differences, such as man in nations or other groups, could develop or disappear was simply incontestable. As a result, while accepting a common genetic framework, several writers were free to emphasize the plasticity of traits or the accumulated effects of the environment, the positive or negative side of Lamarckism, as they see fit. What Marx and Engels said about blacks. In analyzing Marx and Engels' comments on blacks, there are at least two elements to consider: the content of their views and the style in which they are expressed. As for the content of their views, they wrote little directly on the subject, although there is relevant indirect evidence. As noted in the introduction, Marx commented approvingly on Temas's claim that blacks had degenerated from a master race. Temas's general views on race are interesting and shed light on Marx's views of both blacks and Slavs. It is perhaps worth quoting in some detail Marx's first letter to Engels urging him to read Temas's book. In his historical and political histories, Temas is far more important and fruitful than Darwin. Only here is a natural basis found for certain issues, such as nationality, etc. For example, he corrects the Polish, Duchinski, whose concern about the geographical differences between Russia and the West Slavs confirms, but in this matter it was not as Duchinski thought, that the Russians were not Slavs being much more Tarlan, etc., but that the prevailing geological formation itself Tartarized and Mongolized the Slavs. As he indicates, he was in Africa for a long time. The common black type is just a degeneration of a much taller one. Against the great laws of nature, the plans of men are but disasters. Witness the efforts of the Tsars to turn the Polish people into Muscovites. The same nature, the same faculties, revive on the same ground. The work of destruction never ceases, the work of reconstruction is eternal. The Slavic and Lithuanian races have their true border with the Muscovite in the great geological line that extends north of the Niemen and Dnieper basins. South of this great line, the capabilities and types of men of this region are and will always remain different from those of Russia. As Marx's excerpt indicates, Temas's theory relates the nature of soil to human racial types, a type of argument not uncommon in the 19th century, although Temas's version is particularly crude. 13. The nature of the soil, according to Temas, changes over time. Older primary or secondary rocks are less perfect than rocks from more recent periods. It follows that children living on more recent land are themselves more perfect, except when recent soil is the product of erosion from old rocks. Perfection in humans is largely defined in aesthetic terms, For example, blacks are ugly, not because of their color, which for Temas is an unimportant feature of the breed, but because of their shape, while white Caucasians, especially Greeks, are beautiful. What makes the new terrain more perfect, except that in a sense it is more complex or varied, is not clear from the text. On the other hand, Temas suggests that there is no mechanism by which soil perfection can translate into an improvement of human direction. Their whole argument is based, in fact, on correlations. People with similar characteristics tend to live in the same types of soil. For example, Newfoundlanders, who live on old rocks, are a kind of black. Black Americans, however, are much closer to white Americans than to Aboriginal Australians. There are, therefore, as many different human races as there are soils of different types. Even within France, Temas claims, the people of Brittany, who live on old soil, are religious, superstitious, traditional in their loyalties and willing to put their government in the hands of a king, while the people of Paris, who live on newly developed land, are intelligent, industrial, independent and favor representative government. However, the effect of soil on racial differences is not always so clear. On the one hand, there may be miscegenation at the stage when the differences have just begun to develop, the soil diversifies, fertility unifies. On the other hand, certain factors, such as the nature of the diet, can intervene and mask the action of the soil. Slavery, for Temas, is another degenerative force that can work for purposes crossed with the action of the soil. In general, however, there is a parallel between the perfection of human beings and that of the soil. Temas even uses his theory to explain why the Confederate South, which was not at all industrialized, was able to resist the North for so long. Given the higher quality of the South soil, he predicts that even if the North wins the Civil War, it will inevitably be ruled by the South. Degenerate races, therefore, are those that migrated to geographically inferior terrain. Egyptians who moved south to Sudan, for example, have less perfect characteristics than those in the north. The degeneration of the Mayan civilization is explained as the result of migration to a less perfect soil than people. Temas is clearly a monogynist. He explains human racial differences not in terms of multiple origins, but in terms of degeneration of a common kind. For example, he insists that black is not a perfected ape but a degenerate human being. Moreover, we are not entirely helpless in the face of geological and racial differences. In addition to the possibility of migration, man can have some influence on soil quality through the reforestation of land and the use of fertilizers. It is interesting to note that Temas's extreme environmentalist approach extends to life on other planets, on which the perfection of life would also be a function of soil, varying with the degree of development of parasites. Parasites in herbivores, according to Temas, do not advance beyond a certain low level of development. When eaten by carnivores whose intestinal tract is more advanced, they also progress. Apparently, the intestinal tract is the soil equivalent for these organisms. It is certainly not my intention to insinuate, on the basis of his input for Temas's book, that Marx accepted all these aspects of the theory. Marx acknowledges that the book has many definitions, although he is not explicit as to what they are, but his enthusiasm for Temas's general theory, which even in the 19th century is particularly simple, can only be explained by the extent of his disenchantment with Darwin or by his desire to find a basis in the natural sciences for his cultural prejudices or, most likely, both. At Marx's urging, Engels bought a copy of the book and, frightened at what he found, replied, "I have come to the conviction that there is nothing in his theory but there is no other reason than because he does not understand geology nor is he capable of the most ordinary literary historical criticism." One might laugh sickly at their stories of the Black Saint Mary and the transmutations of whites into blacks. Especially, that the traditions of Senegalese children deserve absolute credulity, just because scoundrels cannot write. Of course, it is good to blame the formation of the soil for the difference between a Basque, a Frenchman, a Breton, and an Alsatian, and of course, it is also their fault that these people speak four different languages. Perhaps this man demonstrates in the second volume, how he explains the fact, that we Renans not long ago have become idiots and blacks in our own Devonian transition in rocks. Or maybe he maintains that we are the real niggers. This book is worthless, a pure invention, which defies all facts and would have to give proof for every piece of evidence it adduces. 1.4. Marx does not seem to have been much influenced by Engels' criticism, as the next day he responded, defending Temas, in a letter that ends, Temas's basic idea about the influence of soil is, in my opinion, an idea that only needs to be announced, to ensure once and for all the right of citizenship in science. And, at that time, totally independent of Temas's presentation. Engels responded 2 days later in a much softer letter in tone than the first, admitting that Temas's book might have some value after all. He had only read a third of the book at the time of his original response to Marx. In particular, it notes, this man has the distinction of having emphasized the influence of soil on racial formation and, logically, of species more than has happened so far. And secondly, to have developed more correct opinions on the effect of crossing than their predecessors, although in my opinion very one-sided. There is something tremendously plausible in the hypothesis that soil becomes generally more favorable for the development of higher species in proportion to their belonging to newer formations. Despite these concessions, the central idea of Engels' letter is primarily critical. It repeats the arguments made earlier and also suggests new arguments. At this point, the correspondence between Marx and Engels on Temas apparently breaks down, but Marx writes shortly thereafter to Ludwig Kugelmann recommending the book despite its fuzzy style, geological errors, and deficiency in literary historical criticism as an advance on Darwin. Although Engels more or less dismisses Temas's book, nothing in his commentaries indicates any disagreement with Temas's or Marx's characterization of blacks, or Slavs, or the view of cultural differences reflecting biological ones. Engels' complaint is that Temas is a poor geologist. Engels himself clearly believes that at least some human races degenerated from the higher ones. As he writes in The Role Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man. At first, therefore, the operations, for which our ancestors gradually learned to adapt their hands during the many thousands of years of transition from ape to man, could only have been very simple. The lowest savages, even those in a regression to a more animal condition, with simultaneous physical degeneration, it can be assumed, are nevertheless far superior to these transitional beings. If, for Engels, degeneration cannot be explained on the basis of geology, how can it be explained? To the extent that Engels considers this problem at all, he seems to think that the introduction of milk and meat into the diet produced larger brains in human races. He apparently accepted literally Feuerbach's famous saying Der Mensch ist was isst, man is what he eats. At the origin of the family, private property, and the state, Engels writes, the abundant supply of milk and meat and, in particular, the beneficial effect of these foods on the growth of children perhaps explain the superior development of the Aryan and Semitic breeds. It is a fact that the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, who are reduced to an almost entirely vegetarian diet, have a smaller brain than the Indians in the lower stage of barbarism, who eat more meat and fish. Engels was probably influenced in this view by Lewis Henry Morgan, on whose book Ancient Society, or Researches in the Lines of Human Progress from Savagery Through Barbarism to Civilization, Engels wrote, on the original states of society there is a definitive book, a book as definitive as Darwin's for biology. It has, of course, been discovered by Marx. Morgan, Ancient Society, 1877. Marx makes extensive excerpts with notes by Morgan and, to a lesser extent, from the works of anthropologists Henry Maine, John Lubbock, and John Fear. 2.1 Engels later used Morgan's book as a starting point for The Origin of the Family, whose subtitle is In Light of the Investigations of Lewis Henry Morgan. In Ancient Society, Morgan expresses the view that those Indian tribes that domesticated animals, and were therefore able to incorporate meat and milk into the diet, developed larger brains as a result. He goes on to suggest, the Aryan and Semitic families owe their preeminent gifts to the large scale on which, as far as our knowledge extends, they have been identified with the maintenance in number of the animals of the dome. In fact, they incorporate them, meat, milk and muscle into their life plan. No other family of mankind has done this in equal measure, and the Aryan has done so to a greater extent than the Semitic. It is worth noting in this context that Morgan held, in relation to blacks, extreme racist views. In fact, although he is generally described as a misogynist, Morgan believed that the black race was so backward as to refute the notion that all human races have a common origin. He was, still, a fervent abolitionist, at least in part on the basis that the black race would become extinct if emancipated. As he told William Seward, "It is too intellectually thin a race to be fit to spread, and I am perfectly satisfied with the reflection that the feeling towards this race is one of hostility throughout the North. We have no respect for them." Morgan's views on race were most clearly expressed in Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity, a book familiar to both Marx and Engels too. For in this work, blacks are characterized as follows: few in number, weak in intellect and in rank to all other parts of the human family, they focus on themselves, on their unknown and mysterious present past, one of the greatest problems in the science of the families of humanity. They seem to challenge and pierce all the evidences of the unity of origin of the human family by their excessive deviation from such a standard of the species as would probably be adopted in the assumption of unity of origin. In light of our current knowledge, black is the main obstacle in the way of establishing the unity of origin of the human family, based on scientific evidence. That Marx and Engels did not dissociate themselves from Morgan's racial views in itself proves nothing. It acquires meaning only in the context of their general views. In this regard, it is worth noting that both Marx and Engels accepted Ernst Haeckel's theory that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that individual development repeats the evolutionary history of the species. It was certainly possible in the late 19th century to be a recapitulationist without being racist. However, Haeckel's views had come to be so closely associated with racism that one might expect Engels, at least, since he was much more concerned with Haeckel than Marx, to depart from that aspect of his theory, especially since he was critical of Haeckel's general policy, and for some extent philosophical opinions. 2.6. Both Marx and Engels sometimes used the English term nigger to refer to blacks and others for whom they despised, for example, the frequent references in their correspondence to the black Jewish las alet. It is amusing to note that the Soviet English edition of his letters includes the following explanation, with reference to the use of the word black that appears in this book: Marx used the word while living in England, in the last century. The word does not have the same connotation as it does now in the United States and should be read as black whenever it appears in the text. This explanation is not consistent with that of the Oxford English Dictionary or a host of other evidence. For example, when J.C.H.N. Stuart Mill responded to Carlyle's infamous 1849 essay in Fraser's Magazine, Occasional Discourse on the Black Question, he titled his answer "The Black Question." If the word black was not as jarring in mid-19th century England as it is in English Earth or America today, however, it was an abused term. The public writings of Marx and Engels on the American Civil War are certainly sympathetic to the cause of the Negres. It is predominantly in their private correspondence that one finds references to blacks and, in relation to Jews, Yids, Itzigiki, the Jew so-and-so, imitating Jewish speaking patterns, referring disparagingly to Jewish physical characteristics, and so on. For some, Marx and Engels have both public and private personalities. This will become even more evident when we consider their views on Jews. What Marx and Engels said about the Jews. The writings of Marx and Engels on the Jews have been discussed at length by others, although this has certainly not resulted in anything resembling general agreement on the nature of their views. Despite the great literature that already exists, it may be worth making some points relevant to the debate from the perspective of this document. First, whether or not Marx and Engels were anti-Semitic, they were clearly not racists in the modern sense of considering Jews to be biologically distinct, at least for Aryans, as they generally refer to Aryans and Semites as one compared to other races. However, the question of their attitudes toward Jews is hardly exhausted by that statement. Indeed, a close examination of his writings, including correlation, indicates that a simple characterization of his views is not possible. There have been a number of recent attempts to portray Marx, and to a lesser extent Engels, as proto-fascists. George Watson has found in Marx's writings the intellectual origins of the Red Army faction, one of whose leaders, Ulrich Meinhof, publicly blamed the failure of the German left for its blindness to the fact that anti-Semitism is really a hatred of capitalism. Hugh Lloyd-Jones comments that Marx's comments about Lassalle sometimes recall Goebbels' tone. W.H. Chaloner and W. Zero Henderson claims that Marx detested his own race. Max Getman writes that the Jews never knew that Marx had called for their total disappearance from the face of the earth. And Robert Payne points out that Marx's solution to the Jewish question was not much different from Adolf Hitler's. Marx's view as virulently anti-Semitic is based on a particular reading of his two well-known review essays, published in 1844 under the general title Die Judenfrage, on the Jewish questions, one of which emphasizes Marx's prediction that Judaism will appear, the Jew will become impossible. In Marx's phrase, in a socialist society. But Marx's view as an anti-Semite is based much more frequently on his derogatory comments about Jews as race and as individuals than on a particular interpretation of Die Judenfrage's argument. These unflattering comments appear mainly in the second essay of Die Judenfrage, in Herr Voigt, the as yet untranslated 1860 manuscript, into English, with its extraordinarily tasteless Joseph Moses Levy, editor of the London Daily Telegraph, whose nose length provides the focal point for 3 pages of abuse, in several articles that appeared in Die Neue Rheinische, the newspaper edited by Marx and Engels in 1848-49, and in their private correspondence. Comments in private correspondence, especially Marx's comments on the character and appearance of Ferdinand Lassalle, are frequently cited in support of the thesis that Marx was a self-hating Jew. Edward Bernstein edited these commentaries from the original edition of the Marx-Engels correspondence, 1913, and for many years the most famous letter was said to be forged. Its inclusion in the official East German edition of the collected works of Marx and Engels effectively ended that debate. The letter, which is actually more insulting to blacks than to Jews, reads as follows. The black Jewish Lassalle, who fortunately left at the end of the week, had lost, again fortunately, 3,000 thaler in bad speculation. The guy would rather throw the money in the gutter than lend it to a friend, even if interest and capital were guaranteed. In that, it gives the impression that he must live as a Jewish baron or as a baronial Jew, probably through the countess. It is now completely clear to me that, as his head shape and hair growth prove, he is a descendant of the blacks who joined Moses on the journey out of Egypt. If not, his mother or grandmother on his father's side crossed paths with a black man. Now, this combination of Judaism and Teutonicism with a Negroid basis must produce a strange product. The obstruction of the type is indeed Negroid. One of the great discoveries of our Negro, which he shared with me as a friend of greater confidence, is that the Pelagians came from the Semites. Some Marx scholars insist that Marx was not, and given his general philosophical perspective could not have been, anti-Semitic. They base this claim on a particular reading of Die Judenfrage, especially the first essay and, to a lesser extent, the Holy Family. None of Marx's defenders, as far as I know, at least, deny that Marx equated Judaism with the spirit of mercantilism and self-interest. The message of Die Judenfrage is quite clear. Consider the real Jew, verbally, not the Sabbath Jew, as Bauer does, but the everyday Jew. Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the true Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is your worldly God? Money. All right then. The emancipation of huckstering and money, in consequence of practical and real Judaism, would be the self-emancipation of our time. However, the Contra-Argumento states that Die Judenfrage is not anti-Semitic in spirit for the following reasons. First, the Jews had arrived, as a result of their exclusion from guilds, professions, and agriculture, to a commercial people, driven by a commercial religion, which historically played a central role in the development of capitalism. So Marx's economic Jewish stereotype may be exaggerated, but it contains a great element of truth. Moreover, since Marx was writing at a time before sociological and historical studies exposed the exaggeration of the stereotype held by many Jews, Marx should at least not be singled out for special guilt. Second, and more importantly, the counterargument continues, the spirit of Die Judenfrage is anything but anti-Semitic. As offensive as his tone may be to 20th century ears with his experience of Hitlerism and other anti-Semitic movements, the central thesis of the essays is that the political emancipation of Jews should not wait for general social emancipation. It is, such scholars insist, an argument, directly largely against the left-wing Hegelian Bruno Bauer, in favor of granting full political fairness to Jews in the here and now, not in a liberated future. Undoubtedly, political equality represents only a limited step on the road to full social emancipation, since it leaves intact those property relations from which the most basic equalities are necessarily derived. However, the emancipation of the state from religion, i.e., the separation of the state from all theological concerns, represents a genuine, if limited, advance in human freedom. Political emancipation should not be confused with social emancipation, but they are interrelated. Indeed, the extent to which the state has divorced itself from religious concerns, of which Jewish emancipation is perhaps the best index, indicates the degree of modernity of a state. Therefore, those states that had not yet granted the Jews political equality must be considered backward. Engels is particularly clear in his condemnation of anti-Semitism as reactionary. It is nothing more than the reaction of the medieval and decadent strata of society against modern society, which consists essentially of wage earners and capitalists, under a mask of apparent socialism. Therefore, it only serves reactionary ends. It is a variety of feudal socialism, and with that we can have nothing to do. What is striking about the markedly contradictory arguments about Marxist anti-Semitism is that they are based on generally different types of evidence. The view that Marx and Engels were anti-Semitic is largely based on their style, on the contempt they express for Judaism as a religion and for most Jews as individuals, especially, though not exclusively, in their correspondence. The opposite view is based on the argument of Die Judenfrage and, to a lesser extent, on the philosophical writings of the Holy Family and Marx in general. Both types of evidence are relevant, and together they indicate that no simple characterization of the views of Marx and Engels is defensible. They had a general philosophical position that led them to support the full political rights of the Jews. It is therefore absurd to insinuate, as some writers do, that Marx expected a world without Jews 40 as if he embraced their physical extermination. On the other hand, it is equally clear that Marx was very sensitive to his Jewish origins and that he and Engels did not like most Jews and accepted all current anti-Jewish stereotypes, including those that by their own personal experience and knowledge of history should have had reason to doubt. Julius Karl Bach has recently demonstrated how little merit there is in the claim of some scholars, such as David McClellan, that Marx's use of the term Judentum in Die Judenfrage is essentially devoid of religious and racial content. Marx himself claimed that not only in the Pentateuch or the Talmud, but also in today's society, we find the nature of the contemporary Jew, not as an abstract nature but as a supremely empirical nature, and he certainly makes empirical claims about the Jewish religion and Jewish history, claims that Karl Bach makes. It shows that they are even more despicable and certainly less informed than those of their predecessors, such as Feuerbach and Bauer. Moreover, both Marx and Engels disapprove of what they consider to be every characteristic of contemporary Jews. From Marx's comments in the second essay of Die Judenfrage, another material published by Marx and Engels, and especially their private correspondence, we know that they believed that the Jews were selfish, interested only in making money, capable of determining the fate of Europe through their control of international finance, even greasy. Given all the available evidence, I believe that the attitude of Marx and Engels towards the Jews can reasonably be characterized as follows. As a result of their particular historical situation, Jews have developed a wide range of unpleasant characteristics, all directly or indirectly associated with money-making. These historically conditioned traits will inevitably disappear in a society where obtaining money is not possible. When Judaism loses its practical basis, the Jew as we know it will cease to exist and the Jewish problem will simply dissolve. However, it follows that in the present, unlike the socialist future, Jews as a class are the kind of people one would not want to associate much with. That it is not their fault and that it will not always be so does not alter the fact that for Marx and Engels almost all Jews were characterized by highly undesirable traits. Although they rationalized their attitude toward particular Jews, they accepted as true this characterization that, if accepted by others, could not help but create a socialist attitude of contempt toward the real and worldly Jew. That is the true basis of socialist anti-Semitism, the link that connects Marx to the shameful position of almost all socialists in the Dreyfus case and the anti-Semitic views of at least part of the modern European left. A note about the Irish. There is a striking parallel between Marx and Engels' view of the Jews and that of the Irish. The Irish also, as a result of historical circumstances, possess many undesirable traits, traits almost unlike those that characterize the Jews. Irish are stupid, addicted to drinking, rough, dirty, passionate about nature, brutal when drunk but otherwise cheerful and happy. In short, at their best they have the virtues of young children, but at worst they are animals. However, even in their most degraded condition, the Irish rise above the level of the savages, another indication of the 19th century Marxist view of non-Western societies. Lest this seem like an exaggeration, some excerpts from Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England will serve to illustrate the point. One worker needs more than another, because the former is accustomed to a higher standard of living than the latter. The Englishman, who is not yet totally uncivilized, needs more than the Irishman, who walks in rags, eats potatoes and lives in pigsties. This does not prevent Irish from competing with English and gradually dragging their salary and standard of living to their own level. Certain jobs can only be performed by workers who have reached a certain degree of civilization, and virtually all industrial employment falls into this category. Two things make life compatible with Irish whiskey and its lively and cheerful character. He drinks himself in a state of brutal intoxication. Everything combines to lead the Irishman to drink: his cheerful temperament, similar to that of the Mediterranean peoples, his coarseness, which drags him practically to the level of a savage, his contempt for all normal human pleasures, which he is unable to appreciate due to his degraded condition, combined with his dirty habits and his abject poverty. The actual way in which poverty hits the Irish can be explained by the history, traditions, and national characteristics of the people. The Irish have a strong affinity with Latin races such as the French and Italians. The resemblance to the Italians is particularly strong. In Ireland, passions and feelings rule supremely and reason takes a back seat. The sensual and excitable nature of the Irish prevents them from undertaking tasks that require sober judgment and tenacity of purpose. Obviously, such people are not able to participate in the industry as it is carried out today. It is less clear to the Irish, than it is, say, to the Jews, that their distinctive national characteristics, particularly the sensual and excitable nature they share with the Latin races, will disappear completely in the course of historical development. There is an ambiguous quality in Engels' comments on the Irish which, as noted at the beginning of this paper, is typical of 19th-century nationality discussions. However, whatever their peculiarities as a race, the problems of the Irish are mainly the result not of their nature, but of an oppressive social structure. That social structure is internal. Engels does not believe that the degraded status of the Irish can be attributed to English rule, a fact that will become abundantly clear after that government has ended. However, both Marx and Engels are fairly consistent supporters of Irish independence, and apparently not just for tactical reasons. As with the Jews, therefore, the Irish are considered to have a wide variety of unpleasant characteristics that will not be altered by Irish independence. However, as with the Jews, political emancipation does not wait for general social emancipation. What Marx and Engels said about the Slavs. We have already seen in his discussion of Pierre Trémas something of the attitudes of Marx and Engels towards the Slavs. His letters indicate a willingness on Marx's part to adopt, at least temporarily, a biological explanation for the course of Slavic history. While Engels dismisses the book initially as bad science, he later admits that soil may have any influence on race. Nothing in his answers indicates disagreement with Marx's characterization of the Slavs. His published letters and articles, particularly in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, reflect a lifelong concern for the Slavic question and a personal disgust for the Slavs on the part of both men. In fact, her opinion of the Slavs is so low that next to her portraits of blacks, Jews, and Irish seem almost flattering. And in the case of Engels, the ultimate solution to the Slavic question lies not in general social emancipation, but in the extermination of the Slavs as a people. This solution derives from Engels' view of historical development in general and Slavic history in particular, not, at least obviously, from any belief in natural Slavic inferiority. Marx and Engels' objections to panslavism have been thoroughly discussed elsewhere. 49. What is of interest to this article is that, first, Marx tried to reinforce his anti-Slavic views with geobiological arguments, and that, second, although Engels did not, his characterization of the Slavs and the solution to the Slavic question were considerably harsher than Marx's, a good indication of the difficulty, and perhaps futility, of distinguishing racial views from purely cultural ones of inferiority in the 21st century. At the very least, the difficulty provides a warning against the all-too-easy 20th century assumption that cultural theories of human differences are necessarily more benign in their implications than those based on nature. Not only German hegemony over the Slavs, but also American expansion was defended by Engels in the interest of civilization. The struggle for self-determination by peoples without history, peoples who have not followed that course of historical development that leads to capitalism, is viewed with contempt. Engels' comments on American expansionism, in an article denouncing Slavic nationalism, illustrate this attitude. As part of a discussion with Bakunin, he writes, "How does it happen then, that in these two republics, the United States and Mexico, that according to the moralistic theory should be fraternal and federated, a war broke out over Texas, that the sovereign will of the American people, supported by the courage of the American volunteers, by geographical, commercial, and strategic needs, moves a border line drawn by nature a few hundred miles further south? And will Bakunin be to reproach the American people for waging a war that undoubtedly deals a severe blow to their theories based on justice and humanity, but which was nevertheless waged solely in the interest of civilization? Or is it perhaps a disgrace that the splendid land of California has been taken from Mexican sloths who did not know what to do with it? Is it a mistake that through the rapid exploitation of the mines of California has been taken from the Mexican sloths who did not know what to do with it? Is it a mistake that through the rapid exploitation of the mines of California gold there the energetic Yankees have increased the means of circulation, they have built big cities, they have opened steamboat lines, they are laying railways? Because of this, the independence of some Spanish Californians and Texans may suffer, occasionally justice and other moralistic principles may be harmed, but what do they count in comparison to such world historical events? 50. Czechs and South Slavs, like lazy Mexicans and other orderly peoples, lack the historical requirements for independence. their nationalisms are necessarily counter-revolutionary. With the exception of the Poles, the Russians and, at best, the Slavs in Turkey, no Slavic people has a future, for the simple reason that all other Slavs lack the most basic, historical, geographical, political, and industrial prerequisites for independence and vitality. Peoples who have never had a history of their own, who from the moment they reached the first and crudest stages of civilization have already fallen under foreign domination, or who were only forced into the early stages of civilization through a foreign yoke, have no vitality, they will never be able to achieve any kind of independence. Or as expressed in a different essay, there is no country in Europe that does not at some point contain one or more ruins of people, remains of previous inhabitants, pushed back and subjected to the nation that later became the bearer of historical development. These remnants of nations that have been mercilessly defrauded by the passage of history, as Hegel put it, this ethnic garbage always becomes and remains until its complete extermination or denationalization, the most fanatical bearer of the counter-revolution, since its entire existence is nothing more than a protest against a great history. Revolution. Such were in Scotland the Gaels, the supporters of the Stuarts from 1640 to 1745. Such were in France the Bretons, the supporters of the Bourbons from 1792 to 1800. Such in Spain were the Basques, supporters of Don Carlos. Such in Austria are the Panslavist South Slavs, who are nothing more than the waste products of a highly confusing development that has lasted 1,000 years. Moreover, Engels' solution to the Slavic question is at least close to what some scholars have seen, I argued before, erroneously, as Marx's solution to the Jewish question. Some brief excerpts from Engels' articles in the Neue Rheinische illustrate his fanaticism. Then it's war. An incessant struggle to the death with Slavdom, who betrays the revolution, a battle of annihilation and ruthless terrorism, not in the interest of Germany but of the revolution. The next World War will cause not only reactionary dynasties, but also entire reactionary peoples to disappear from the earth. And that would also be progress. 54. Among all the nations and small ethnic groups of Austria there are only 3 that have been bearers of progress, that have played an active role in history and that still retain their vitality, the Germans, the Poles, and the Magyars. For this reason they are now revolutionaries. The primary mission of all other races and peoples, large and small, is to perish in the revolutionary Holocaust. Conclusion. Marx and Engels are considered by some to be extreme racists, by others to be anti-racists. They were neither. The only surprising thing about the racial views of Marx and Engels is their ordinariness. Their attitudes were the typical attitudes of 19th-century Europeans who, regardless of their ideology, thought in terms of a hierarchy of cultures with their own at the top and who occasionally used biology to provide a scientific basis for their categorization of societies into higher and lower forms. The use of biology by Marx and Engels, like that of many of their contemporaries, was sporadic, ad hoc, and sometimes non-existent, as in Marx's geobiological explanation of Slavic history, which, however, evidently did not apply to Poles for whom both he and Engels held the highest regard. In addition, for them the biological differences were, at least in some cases, capable of being improved. As Engels' view of the Slavs indicates, in the 19th century the judgment that a people lacks a history of its own may be harsher than the view that, as a result of soil, diet, or other natural factors, a people is biologically degenerate. Here there is a widespread, and I think unfortunate, tendency to transform Marx and Engels into progressives on all issues of interest in the 20th century. It was Marx who wrote, "With the same right with which France has taken Flanders, Lorraine, and Alsace, and, sooner or later, will take Belgium, with that same right Germany takes Silesia, with the right of civilization against barbarism, of progress against stability. This right is worth more than all treaties, because it is the right to historical development." However, the anti-colonialist image of Marx and Engels is hardly affected by this and other contrary evidence. They were not consistent with the colonialists and were not progressive in race, they were simply not better or worse than most of their contemporaries. More than 50 years ago, George Lukács wrote in History and Class Consciousness that all philosophies, including Marxism, reflect certain assumptions of the era in which they were born. 57. The important question today is to what extent Marxist categories are informed by the 19th century cultural prejudices of Marx and Engels. Diana Paul.